the Medici.
Cosimo III.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Cosimo III. Born 1642, reigned 1670 to 1723, died 1723. To those who have watched the many illustrious achievements of this family during a course of nearly 300 years, it is deplorable indeed to witness the rapid descent to ignominy which now set in. Down the steep path from degradation to degradation go the Medici, and down with them, dragged at their chariot wheels, goes Tuscany also. And could Lorenzo the Magnificent have stood again in Florence, he might have inverted the form of his speech and said, "The state goes with the house." They rose and fell together. The death of all ability, the death of all high and generous sentiments, the death of all strength and force of character. This is what is set before us in the 53 years' reign of Cosimo III. Great things are being done in other parts of Europe. The victories of the Great Turenne, the victories of Marlborough, Blenheim, Ramier, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet, the spread of science, literature, and art in other countries. But Tuscany has no part in these things, and leads the way no more to anything but degeneracy and ruin. Cosimo was 28 years old when he succeeded to the throne. His character has already been noted. His travels had not produced any marked improvement in him, their chief effect having been only to give him an unbounded love of ostentation, with the result that the magnificence and luxury of his court far exceeded that of any previous reign. For the first 3 years matters proceeded tranquilly. Peace for a time prevailed between the Grand Duke and his wife, Marguerite Louise. The strong respect which Cosimo entertained for his uncle Leopold's opinion gave promise of wisdom and moderation in the government, while the birth in 1671 of a second son, who was named Giovanni Gastone, was welcomed as rendering more secure the continuance of the family. But this satisfactory state of affairs did not last long. Cosimo's subordination to priestly influence, together with the constant interference of his foolish mother, Vittoria della Rovere, in all matters, after a time provoked the Grand Duchess Marguerite Louise to demand in 1674 a share in the government. This being refused, she withdrew to Poggio a Caiano, wrote thence to Cosimo, saying, "You make the unhappiness of my life, and I make the unhappiness of yours," and demanded a final separation and permission to return to France. To this Cosimo, afraid of the strong public opinion which existed in her favour, had to consent. Accordingly, delighted to be able at last to turn her back on the country which had been to her like a prison for 13 years, Marguerite Louise left Tuscany for France, where she took up her abode at the convent of Montmartre, near Paris. This was followed by the death in 1675 of Cosimo's uncle, Cardinal Leopold, who died at the age of 58, and with him departed all ability and common sense in the conduct of affairs. The Grand Duchess Vittoria, the field being thus left vacant, now gained the entire influence, and where she was paramount, every folly was a certainty. Ferdinand II's ministers were replaced by others of her selection, chosen as a rule from the cloister, men so utterly without capacity or spirit that Magalotti compared them to little children, frightened lest they should be sent back to school. Theology became a substitute for statesmanship, and in a short time universal contempt for Tuscany and its sovereign began to be the prevailing sentiment among other powers, while in home affairs one ill-advised measure after another followed in rapid succession. Meanwhile Marguerite Louise was highly popular at the French court, where her lively sallies and constant ridicule of Cosimo and the Tuscan court greatly amused Louis XIV. This made Cosimo furious, increasing his naturally bad temper almost to madness. He threatened to stop her allowance, but Louis XIV forbade him to do so, and Cosimo stood far too much in awe of the French monarch to disobey. The history of Cosimo III's long reign of over half a century is one of every evil which a ruler at once vain, weak, tyrannical, entirely wanting in brains, and sunk in superstition and bigotry, can create. The record becomes wearisome by reason of the constant repetition of the same enormities and imbecilities, while the condition of the outraged people grew ever more deplorable. Cosimo was his own minister of justice. His avarice caused him to overtax his subjects, his bigotry to arraign them for offences outside the scope of all ordinary laws, his weak yet tyrannical disposition to inflict upon them punishments outrageous in their cruel severity. And these effects, when combined with the measures to which an earnest but mistaken view of religion led a foolish and superstitious character, produced results which made the condition of the people under the worst of Asiatic rulers more tolerable than that of the people of Tuscany under Cosimo III. Crime, poverty, cruel punishments, and priestly interference in every detail of domestic life reduced the inhabitants to the last stage of wretchedness. Cosimo considered it his mission to dragoon his subjects into morality, and his methods in this particular created untold misery. The most ferocious punishments were daily meted out for the smallest offences, or supposed offences, against morality. The chain and the lash were in constant requisition. The periodical visits of a Dominican friar who made minute examination into all family matters, and by the royal authority commanded marriages, separations, or imprisonment, destroyed all possibility of domestic happiness. Dissimulation spread like a pestilence, priests and hypocrisy pervaded all. Marriage portions given to girls recommended by ecclesiastics, pensions given to crowds of so-called converts, a crushing taxation, laws conceived in entire ignorance of all commercial or agricultural affairs, outrageous punishments for trivial offences. These and similar measures caused many of the inhabitants to take flight from the country, while those who remained became idle, false, and bigoted. Thus did Cosimo's early training, habits, and disposition reduce a high-spirited and intellectual people to the most abject state of moral and material degradation ever known. One of the worst features in Cosimo was his dislike of his sons, whom in the most ill-advised manner he persistently bullied. Both of them had good natural dispositions and abilities, but both were in turn ruined through the treatment they sustained from their father, and this in the end brought about the most disastrous consequences to the family. A mixture of extravagance and niggardliness, he kept a tight hold on his purse strings where his sons were concerned, employing this means of coercing them to his will. Prince Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, had as his instructors Viviani, Redi, Noris, the brothers Lorenzini, and other distinguished men of the time, and being full of talent and intelligence, promised to offer a striking contrast to his father whenever he should be called upon to rule. By the year 1680, when he was 17, this young prince began to find the follies of the Grand Duchess Vittoria insupportable, and to revolt more and more from her authority. He was prohibited by Cosimo from corresponding with his mother, whose extravagant conduct in Paris continued, and who openly declared her intention, whenever Cosimo's intemperance brought his life to an end, of going to Florence, chasing hypocrites and hypocrisy from the court, discharging all the incompetent sycophants who had been promoted by the Grand Duchess Vittoria, and restoring good government and common sense. Ferdinand espoused his mother's side in the quarrel, disregarded the prohibition against corresponding with her, and when his instructors, the brothers Lorenzini, were most cruelly consigned to permanent imprisonment in the dungeons of Volterra for supporting him, threw off his father's authority altogether, and became the center of a band of well-born young men whose avowed object was to assert themselves in opposition to the monastical atmosphere of the court, to favor music, art, and literature, and to contend against all hypocrisy and dissimulation. This society became immensely popular, all the young scions of the leading Florentine families pressing to join it in their detestation of the rule of the ecclesiastics favored by Cosimo and his mother, while the society was soon still further strengthened by being joined by Cosimo's younger brother, Francesco Maria, who was only 3 years older than his nephew Ferdinand. On his uncle Leopold's death, Francesco Maria had been made a cardinal at the age of 15, but had no taste for the ecclesiastical life. Thus the family was divided into two parties. On the one side the bigoted Cosimo and his still more bigoted mother Vittoria, and on the other his brother Francesco Maria and his eldest son Ferdinand, with the Grand Duchess Marguerite Louise watching from a distance and encouraging the latter party. But the concourse of youthful spirits led by Prince Ferdinand soon, in their revolt from hypocrisy and a monkish style of life, went further than merely favoring music, art, and literature, and developed a taste for pleasure and intemperance which nullified all their good intentions and gave Cosimo an opportunity for applying a thoroughly characteristic remedy. A rigorous family inspection, with a searching investigation into every detail of private habits, was instituted, carried out by friars, and this developed into a regular system of espionage and persecution, which soon put down any tendency to gaiety and pleasure, and made the opponents of dissimulation and hypocrisy themselves practice these means of evading ecclesiastical tyranny. All classes were subjected to this system, while at the same time monks were placed over the parish priests, and kept the people perpetually employed in processions, preachings, and penances. Accusations multiplied, while pardon for imaginary offences was only to be obtained by the payment of large sums of money to the ecclesiastics. Disgusted with this state of things, Prince Ferdinand, being now 22, desired to be allowed to proceed on a tour to see the world, but was kept for 2 years before Cosimo would agree to let him go. In 1687, however, Ferdinand was allowed to depart on a tour in northern Italy, after being first betrothed to the Princess Violante Beatrice of Bavaria. In November 1688 he returned, and the marriage was carried out with a most gorgeous display of magnificence. A special gate was opened in the wall of the city near the Porta San Gallo, and through this the Princess Violante was drawn, in a car profusely studded with gems, to a chapel erected for the occasion. There she was crowned by Cosimo with the grand ducal crown, and thence was conducted to the palace, in a procession of the most extravagant splendour, after which the marriage was performed in the cathedral. Prince Ferdinand was the hope of all those who desired to see a better state of things dawn upon Tuscany. High-spirited, full of ability, and fond of art and science, he had become the centre round whom gathered all who were learned and cultured, and all that portion of Florentine society which had no taste for the atmosphere of hypocrisy which pervaded the court. But his father contrived to bring these bright prospects to ruin. Ferdinand was as energetic and resolute as his father was weak and undecided, and being eager to employ his abilities to some useful purpose, desired to take a part in public affairs. But Cosimo refused to permit him to do so. Disgusted at a fatuous style of government which was dragging the country to ruin, forced to be the daily witness of errors and follies which he was not allowed to remedy, and subjected to chronic bullying by a father who hated him, Ferdinand gradually took to a dissolute course of life, which before he was 40 ruined his health and brought about his death a few years later. Unfortunately he did not care for the wife whom his father had chosen for him, the Princess Violante, though she was in every way worthy of his affection, and deservedly liked by all classes in Florence. she never reproached him for his neglect, and to the last continued to show her affection for him. In the early part of Cosimo's reign, various important additions were made to the art collections in the Uffizi Gallery. Cosimo's intemperance, both in eating and drinking, caused him to suffer from frequent illness, as a remedy for which his physician, the celebrated Redi, prescribed regular walking exercise, and Paolo Falconieri, one of the cultured men whom Prince Ferdinand had gathered round him, suggested that this exercise should be taken in the Uffizi Gallery, and that the Grand Duke should, for his amusement, adorn it with all the best specimens of sculpture belonging to the family. Cosimo took up the idea warmly, removed to the gallery many of the statues hitherto placed in the Boboli Gardens, and caused to be brought from the Villa Medici at Rome most of the remaining works of sculpture which Ferdinand I had collected, including the Venus de Medici, the Wrestlers, the Knife Whetter, and the large number of classic busts and other works of sculpture to be seen in the Uffizi Gallery, then called the Gallery of the Statues. The long corridor between the palace and the Uffizi Gallery, which formed part of this daily walk of the Grand Duke, was also adorned with many pictures, among them the large collection of over 600 portraits of notable persons in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries, which, though they are of no artistic merit, are of much value from an historical point of view. Cosimo also now took in hand an important matter in regard to the family mausoleum. Hitherto the numerous members of the family who had died since it was begun by his great-grandfather Ferdinand I in 1604 had, pending the completion of the mausoleum, been buried temporarily in the new sacristy. Migliore, writing in 1684, in describing the new sacristy, says, "This chapel also serves for burying the bodies of the Grand Dukes and Princes of the blood, placed in the ground beneath, with short inscriptions merely for the record, and not in the form of elegant eulogy such as they merit and their grandeur would require, pending their being transferred to the mausoleum, which is being prepared immediately behind the choir of the church." He also states that in the old sacristy were buried the bodies of Maria Salviati and Cosimo I, with his sons Giovanni and Garzia. Thus, in the new sacristy there had been temporarily buried in this manner some 18 members of the family, viz., Francis I and his wife Joanna, with 2 of their children, Anna and Filippo, Ferdinand I and his wife Christine, with 5 of their children, Francesco, Carlo, Lorenzo, Eleonora and Caterina, Cosimo II and Maria Maddalena, with 4 of their children, Maria Cristina, Giovanni Carlo, Mattias and Leopold, and Ferdinand II. By the year 1685, however, the mausoleum, though still only about half finished, was sufficiently advanced for them to be interred there. Cosimo, therefore, now removed the bodies of all the above from their temporary resting places to the mausoleum. The remains of Giovanni della Bandinere being at the same time brought from Mantua, all were duly placed in the crypt, those of Giovanni della Bandinere and his wife Maria Salviati in the centre, and the whole of their descendants ranged round them. Before the middle of Cosimo's reign was reached, his imbecile method of government had begun to produce serious difficulties. In the disturbed state of Europe, it was urgently necessary that the country should be placed in a proper state of defence, but all military requirements had been ignored by Cosimo's cloister-trained ministers of state, and no money for this purpose was forthcoming. Vast sums were squandered on religious ceremonies, votive offerings, the foundation of convents, and similar objects, while gold was lavishly poured forth on the crowd of monkish satellites who surrounded Cosimo and his mother, and on the spies who infested every family circle. And this inordinate expenditure on such purposes, while the military defences of the country were allowed to go to ruin, caused general exasperation. Public opinion loudly complained of this insane policy, and was led by Prince Ferdinand, who openly condemned his father's conduct, and was backed by public applause, which kept Cosimo in continual fear of a revolution. In 1691 the Princess Anna Maria Ludovica, then 24, the only one of his 3 children for whom Cosimo had any affection, was married to William, Elector Palatine. At the same time Cosimo was granted by the Emperor the title of Royal Highness. But the condition of the country allowed him small opportunity for satisfaction at these new honours. The people rose and surrounded the royal palace, clamouring for bread. The provinces were almost depopulated, and savage bands of marauders roamed over the country in search of a livelihood unobtainable by any other means. Tuscany appeared to be sinking into general anarchy. Fortunately, however, in 1698 the Grand Duchess Vittoria, who had for nearly 60 years been the constant source of discord to the family and ruin to the country, died at Pisa at the age of 72. And this, by removing the chief influence which had led Cosimo into methods which made all satisfactory government impossible, produced some amelioration in the conditions from which the country was suffering. Cosimo's second son, known as Gian Gastone, was by this time 22. He was good-looking and highly educated, having the reputation of being the most cultured prince of his time, and being specially devoted to science, antiquarian studies, and botany. It was considered a special proof of his exceptional attainments that among various other languages he even knew English. But unlike his brother Ferdinand, he preferred a retired and studious life, in company with the distinguished Cardinal Noris, who had been his tutor. His active-minded brother Ferdinand consequently despised him, while his father Cosimo disliked him exceedingly, and with his propensity for always taking the most ill-advised course, gave him a very restricted allowance, and ignored him on all occasions, with the result that Gian Gastone lived neglected by the court, being without the means to share in social dissipations. Gian Gastone, however, cared little for being thus isolated from the life of society so long as he was left to pursue his studies in peace. He had a good disposition, loved a country life, was free from any feelings of ambition, and with the learned cardinal for his companion wanted no other society, and had no other desire than to live this kind of life permanently. But Cosimo, who by his senseless method of treatment had already driven one son into reckless and dissolute courses, now proceeded to do the same with the other. It was no doubt desirable that Gian Gastone should marry, and that he should be induced to lead a less retired life. But Cosimo's methods for attaining these objects were the worst that could have been employed. Fired with the idea of planting a branch of the Medici in Germany, Cosimo arranged, through his daughter the Electress Palatine, when Gian Gastone was 24, that the latter should be married to Anne of Saxe-Lauenburg, daughter of the deceased Duke of Saxe-Lauenburg, who had left no son, and widow of the Count Palatine, Philip of Neuburg, a lady of enormous weight, immense self-will, and no personal attractions. She was coarse and unintellectual, was more like a Bohemian peasant than a princess, cared only for field sports, which Gian Gastone detested, and considered her small patrimony of Reichstadt, a petty village in a secluded part of the mountains in Bohemia, the only place in the world worth living in. Gian Gastone strongly objected to the wife thus chosen for him, who was about as unsuitable to a man of his tastes as could have been found. But Cosimo would not listen to his protests, and after making him accompany him to Loreto to make numerous votive offerings, despatched him to Dusseldorf, the seat of the Elector Palatine, where in July 1697 the marriage was performed, after which Gian Gastone and his uncongenial consort proceeded to the remote Bohemian village which was in future to be his abode. Arrived there, Gian Gastone found himself condemned to live in a small and mean castle in the midst of a village, without any intellectual society, with a wife altogether his inferior, in a country which was buried deep in snow for half the year, and where, during the other half, there was nothing to do but shoot. His wife cared only about horses and dogs, and spent most of her time holding conversations in the stables. She was capricious, hysterical, imperious, brainless, and apt to burst out suddenly in wrath or in tears. And her character and manners had, after 3 years' experience, caused her former husband to take to drink. Giangastone writes to his father that she is nothing more than a contadina. Placed in such conditions, and saddled with a coarse and ill-favored wife, who offended his tastes at every turn, Giangastone stood it for a year, and then fled to join his mother in Paris. Thence he was forced by Cosimo to return to his hated domicile in Bohemia, but the various miseries of his existence there began, ere long, to produce in him a settled melancholy. Nevertheless, from time to time, Giangastone's keen and witty Tuscan spirit caused him to treat facetiously even the dismal circumstances in which he found himself, and his letters to his father occasionally describe the untoward conditions of his life with considerable humour. After a time he tried to induce his wife to come with him for the winter to Prague, but she utterly declined to quit Reichstadt, and flew into a passion whenever the subject was mentioned; and at length the constant quarrels with the vulgar and unrefined woman to whom he had been united, the inclement climate, and disgust at his surroundings, drove Giangastone to remove to Prague, where he took to low society, intemperance, and a generally dissolute life. And henceforth he was more often at Prague than at Reichstadt. By this time Cosimo, whose errors were all caused by egregious vanity and want of wisdom rather than by deliberately malevolent intentions, began to perceive the mistake he had made, and seeing that his elder son's health was failing, and that Giangastone would probably become, ere long, heir to the throne, desired that he should return to Tuscany. But as he would not agree to Giangastone doing so by himself, he turned all his efforts to induce Anne of Saxe-Lauenburg to come, at all events for a time, to Tuscany. Every power was brought to bear to effect this, and the struggle continued for 8 years without avail. Urgent letters from Cosimo to Anne herself, the authority of her relative the Elector Palatine, who visited Reichstadt in person with this object, even the commands of the Pope, all were equally powerless to remove Anne of Saxe-Lauenburg from Reichstadt. Eventually, in 1708, Cosimo gave it up as hopeless, and wrote to Giangastone to return to Florence, leaving her behind. This Giangastone did, and henceforth they lived apart. In 1705 Prince Ferdinand's health began to decline, and as he and the Princess Violante had no children, while the same was the case as regarded Giangastone and his wife Anne, the question of the succession began to be of primary importance in the affairs of Tuscany. Cosimo, therefore, in 1709, compelled his brother Francesco Maria, who was now nearly 50, to resign his cardinal's rank and to marry Eleonora Gonzaga, the young daughter of the Duke of Guastella. But though they went through the marriage ceremony, they separated at once, and Francesco died in the following year, leaving no children. In view of the large families of 3 successive generations, it is remarkable that the Medici should have died out as they did. Cosimo I had 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters. In the next generation, Ferdinand I had also 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters, and in the next generation, Cosimo II had again 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters. Yet from one cause or another, descendants failed to such an extent that in the 5th generation from Cosimo I, the family entirely died out. For nearly 20 years the wars between France, Spain, and Austria had threatened the independence of Tuscany. That state, under Cosimo's clerical administrators, had become ready to be the prey of whoever marched an army into its territory. All the strength it had possessed under Cosimo I and Ferdinand I had departed. Forts had been allowed to fall into disrepair, and their armaments to become obsolete. The fleet had disappeared. The army was contemptible, wanting in men, arms, and equipment. Cosimo had only maintained Tuscany's independence in the midst of these wars by the usual resource of a weak state, that of siding first with one and then with another of the combatants, according to whichever at the moment was the strongest. Their armies had frequently invaded Lombardy, and Tuscany would have been similarly overrun had it not been that each of the three powers was determined to prevent the central state in Italy from becoming the property of either of the others. These conditions were now intensified by its becoming apparent that at no distant date there would remain no descendant of the Medici family to occupy the Tuscan throne, none of Cosimo's three children having any children. Therefore, between the various powers who all cast greedy eyes upon the most important state in Italy, there now began a political contest, which lasted for the next 30 years, as to which of them should become the possessor of Tuscany when that throne should be vacant, the European monarchs watching like wreckers the last moments of the foundering Medici. Meanwhile Cosimo protested furiously against any such question being debated, declaring it to be his right to nominate a successor to the throne after the demise of his sons, and that, even if this were disallowed, the position reverted to that which had existed before Cosimo I created that throne, the right to say by whom they would be governed reverting to the Tuscan people. In 1712 there was assembled the Congress of Utrecht, in which almost every state in Europe took part, and at which each had some claim to urge, as a portion of the terms of any general peace which might be effected. At this Congress, Cosimo's right to nominate a successor to the throne of Tuscany on the death of his second son was practically acknowledged by the powers. Although not a final settlement of the question, it was a matter of common knowledge that Cosimo intended to nominate his daughter, the Electress Anna Maria Ludovica, to succeed his second son if she outlived the latter, and the Emperor Charles VI signified to her and to Cosimo that he would be ready to give his sanction to this arrangement. In 1718, when Cosimo was 71, his eldest son, Prince Ferdinand, died at the age of 50. He was greatly lamented in Tuscany, not only on account of his abilities, his agreeable disposition, which caused the excesses of his later years to be forgiven, and his constant opposition to the foolish methods of government by which the country was being brought to ruin, but also on account of the high hopes which had been entertained of the complete change which it was felt he would have introduced whenever he succeeded to the throne. Upon the death of Cosimo's eldest son, the Florentine Senate was convened, and passed a decree which was confirmed by the Grand Duke that on the death of Prince Giovanni Gastone, his sister, the Electress Anna Maria Ludovica, should succeed to the throne. This decree was formally promulgated and communicated to the various courts of Europe, its promulgation in Florence being accompanied by public festivities. Austria declined to agree, declaring that the decree showed that Cosimo's ultimate intention was to give Tuscany to a Bourbon, but Cosimo placed his chief reliance on England and Holland, who were both ready to withstand Austria in the matter, George I being specially opposed to any foreign power obtaining a preponderating influence in Italy. France also did not object to the decree, Louis XIV only taking exception to its incompleteness, and urging that prudence, policy, and national justice pointed to the ultimate successor being the Princess Elizabeth of Parma, through Margherita de Medici, daughter of Cosimo II. Lastly, Philip V of Spain took a still more definite course, by promptly marrying the Princess Elizabeth, as a preliminary to claiming Tuscany for Spain when the time came. Meanwhile the Peace of Utrecht, 1714, took place without any opposition being made by any of the powers to the Electress Anna Maria Ludovica being considered the rightful successor to the throne of Tuscany, after her brother Giovanni Gastone. In 1715 Louis XIV died, his death causing important changes in European politics, and in 1716 the Electress Anna Maria Ludovica, now 50 years of age, became a widow, and returned from Dusseldorf to Florence, where she immediately became the principal personage at the court. On her arrival, Ferdinand's widow, the Princess Violante, retired to Siena, of which she was made governor. The altered state of European affairs caused by the death of Louis XIV led, in 1718, to a quadruple alliance between England, Holland, France, and Austria. And these powers, in a treaty concluded at London, decided, without even consulting the Grand Duke of Tuscany, that on the death of Cosimo's son, Gian Gastone, Tuscany should go to Don Carlos of Spain, the eldest son of Elizabeth of Parma, Queen of Spain, this being done in order to pacify Austria as to the chance of a Bourbon being allowed to obtain Tuscany. The article of this treaty which thus sacrificed Tuscany, trampled on a formal national decree, and excluded Cosimo's favourite child from the succession, was kept secret, but could not long be concealed. And when it became known, it filled both the Florentines and the Grand Duke with unbounded indignation. The people hated Cosimo, but at the moment this feeling was swallowed up in their wrath against the four powers who had thus treated their country. Cosimo sent vehement protests to all the powers concerned, but each of them profited in various ways by other clauses in the treaty, and would do nothing to invalidate it, and Cosimo was informed that he must submit, and that if he did not, foreign troops would be sent into Tuscany to hold it for disposal, in accordance with the Treaty of London. Thus did Cosimo see himself insulted, his country sold, and the independence of Tuscany annihilated. But at this juncture Cosimo, though he was now 76 years old, displayed an energy and vigour at variance with all his previous history. Troops were raised throughout Tuscany, the fortresses were repaired and their armaments brought up to date, the harbour defences of Portoferraio and Leghorn were strengthened, and every arrangement made to resist to the uttermost. Tuscany, if it was to perish as an independent state, should die fighting. At the same time, Cosimo drew up a formal declaration to the powers which stated that no successor to the Medici could be recognized in the free and independent state of Tuscany unless approved by the people through their representative, the Florentine Senate. Therefore, no power had a right to exclude the Electress Anna as chosen by that body and hailed with public acclamation, and that, except by violence, there was no way of making a free nation submit to feudal supremacy, a thing utterly at variance with its nature and institutions, or of introducing garrisons into a neutral and unoffending country which had only been striving to preserve its own peace without molesting anyone. By this time England and Holland were at war. It was believed that Cosimo's determined attitude must be supported secretly by some other power, while it seemed probable that some new turn in international politics might throw the whole question again into discussion. Cosimo's protest was consequently received with respect. In 1720 peace was again restored, and a fresh congress was assembled at Cambrai. At this congress the whole question of the Tuscan succession was argued out afresh, Cosimo's ambassador being Corsini, who displayed much ability in demonstrating the injustice to Tuscany of the proposed course, and more particularly the certainty that any rule of that country in Austrian hands, which the Florentines feared was now contemplated, would be of a most tyrannical character, while in any case it was, he argued, most unfair not to allow the rule of Tuscany to pass, after Prince Giovanni Gastone's death, to his sister, the Electress Anna Maria Ludovica, she being eminently qualified, both in character and ability, to govern the country well. These discussions at Cambrai continued all the way through the years 1721 and 1722. while the negotiations, intrigues, and secret agreements between the various powers over the bone of contention, Tuscany, were interminable. Meanwhile, age began to tell upon Cosimo. Worn out by these long contests over the independence of his country, and with his strength failing now that he was approaching 80 years of age, he abandoned the rule of the state entirely to his capable daughter, with whose control of affairs her brother Giangastone, only anxious to be left in his beloved seclusion, had no desire to interfere. She conducted all negotiations with foreign powers, showed a capable management of home affairs, mitigated the harsher aspects of Cosimo's laws, and spent much in works of public benefit. Her conduct was widely praised, and it became a general wish that she might survive her brother and succeed to the throne, so that her efforts to make other powers accept the decree of the Florentine Senate were vigorously supported by the people of Tuscany. The memory of her mother's youthful sorrows was revived in September 1721 by the death of the Grand Duchess Marguerite Louise at Paris, at the age of 76, and this increased the regard entertained for the daughter of a princess for whom the Florentines had always felt much sympathy. In 1728, the discussions at Cambrai showing that whatever other arrangements were made between the leading powers of Europe, they were determined to adhere to their unjust treatment of Tuscany, Corsini was instructed to lodge a final solemn protest, with the object of asserting the rights of Cosimo's successor, and of making the act of violence on which the powers were bent more marked. This was the last public act of Cosimo's life, and on the 31st October, 1728, after handing over the government to his son Giangastone, Cosimo III passed away, after a reign of 53 years in which, with the best intentions, he had produced nothing but evil and the utmost national misery. Cosimo III is an example of how a character which in private capacity would have been unobjectionable may in the position of a ruler become a pattern of everything most baneful. In a private sphere he would have been a very ordinary person, and probably much respected, since the chief defects of his character would never, in that case, have had any opportunity of developing. Placed, however, on a throne, the combined effects of his want of wisdom, vanity, weakness, bigotry, and tyranny caused him to present an example of everything that is worst in a ruler. Under him, joyous and light-hearted Tuscany became a vale of tears. Hating his sons, apparently for no other reason than that they were each, in their different ways, more capable than himself, he ruined both their lives by the most narrow-minded domestic tyranny. Lastly, Cosimo III was the first of his house who, by his conduct as a ruler, turned the poorer classes of the people against him, and thereby overthrew that which had always been the strongest bulwark of his family. Such was the result which had been produced by Ferdinand II's weakness in allowing his eldest son to be brought up by a foolish and incapable mother in the manner that he did, whereby evils were entailed for half a century upon both the country and the family, which were appalling in their magnitude and deplorable in their consequences.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.